G'day everybody, how you going today? It is so good to see you. I do hope you are super well. There is yet another rumour on Nikon Rumours, thank you to Nikon Rumours, regarding more potential advancements, and this rumour from my perspective is even more exciting than the Z9H rumour. And why is it more exciting? Because it's more likely to happen from my perspective. Please excuse me, I do have a little bit of a cold or maybe the flu. I'm down here at my warehouse because I have to ship out a big order of books and they have to go now in order to get to the other side of the world in time. And that's how it is. Regardless of how you're feeling in small business, you've just got to keep on keeping on. And anyway, I'm pretty excited about this news. Let's talk about it more in this episode. Indeed. Well, what is the rumour? Well, it's something. It's a variation on something that I have been talking about kind of since the Z9 came out. And I have to say, in a way, it feels quite recently that the Z9 came out, but it's actually 2 years ago this month that it started shipping, and I got mine on the 24th of December. And of course, we've known about it for over 2.5 years. Besides the fact that the Z9 has given us, with its sensor, class-leading, groundbreaking technology, the first camera in the 35mm DSLR and mirrorless space, the first camera to ever remove a mechanical shutter completely. Now, when I first heard about this, it was like, far out, that's a big risk. I wonder what that means. Well, we're shooting on one now, and quite frankly, the Z9 and more recently the Z8 have been two of the most exciting cameras that I've personally used probably ever, because of how much of a ridiculous all-rounder system it is. And for me, I've talked a lot about ergonomics, build quality, but it's not just that. There's the technology that has come with the Z8 and the Z9, which of course is mechanical shutterless. It has brought us 1/32,000th of a second shutter speed. It's given us the sort of shutter speed readout, which, no, it's not global, but it is running at a speed where I'm yet to hear anybody say to me a golf club is bending or a helicopter rotor blade is not straight. So we've reached a point, and of course Nikon wouldn't bring it to market without knowing. They would have tested this thing for years without knowing that it was capable of this sort of result, because they've put it in their flagship and their flagship follow-up camera. We've got this ridiculous platform from the go-get in the Z9. And then Nikon, obviously a long time coming, had this firmware update strategy. We had firmware 2, 3, 4, 4.1. Now 4.1 has brought us what some specialists in this space say is bird AF. That is now exceeding the competition. In the course of under 2 years, not only did Nikon bring us something class leading at the start, they have continued to build upon this. And this is what this video is about. The rumour is yet more firmware is coming for this 2-year-old camera to update it even further. Potentially, if this rumour is true, potentially bringing us some of the things that we had calculated might be possible. This rumour does specifically talk about 45 megapixels at 30 frames per second in RAW. And again, this is something that we calculated probably should or would be possible, considering what it can do in video already. And so you can extrapolate from there. For example, if you went to DX APS-C crop, you've gone from 45.7 megapixels to 19.4 megapixels. That's less than half the data. Why can't that 30 frames per second become, say, 60 frames per second in APS-C RAW? Almost 20 megapixels, 60 frames per second RAW. Whether it's HE Star or not, it doesn't bother me. HE Star has been magnificent, and I've been only using it for over the last 18 months. It has proven to me that it is absolutely spectacular in all the use cases that I use. There's another interesting one running full frame at 60 frames per second, right, full frame, 45 megapixels, 60 frames per second. And how I read this, although I might be misreading it, it's 45 megapixel frame 1, then frame 2 and 3 are 11 megapixels, and then it goes back to 45 megapixels in a constant loop. So 45, 11, 11, 45. And it's not clear if this mode is RAW or JPEG, but that's another interesting one. 60 frames per second, 45, 11, 11, 45, 11, 11, 45, 11, 11. Another one that's quite interesting, and let's keep in mind that these firmware updates are a long time in the pipeline, and you can hear some people coming out and saying, oh, they're just copying Sony. Sony only just announced the A9 III, and this firmware, if it's real, it would have been coming for months, if not a year. And that is the idea that while you're shooting 30 frames per second, you can actually toggle up to 120 and then back to 30, and you can just jump between those frame rates. Now, it's really interesting because the Sony and the Nikon have been made in isolation. Absolutely, they've been made in isolation. It's obviously perfectly logical that camera companies can come up with similar ideas. I mean, they've been doing it forever. So to kind of preempt any fanboys out there going, Nikon are copying Sony, no chance. This firmware will have been in the pipeline a long time, way before the A9 III announcement, which was just a few weeks ago. Pretty exciting for those that like that sort of thing, to be able to jump between 30 frames per second and 120 frames per second. Not something that I will use very often. Absolutely pre-capture in RAW. Now, there's no information on this Rumour as to whether it's 20 frames per second or 30 frames per second. I think either would be warmly appreciated. RAW, let's talk about that. RAW, running at 20 or 30 frames per second pre-capture. Nobody, to the best of my understanding, is doing that at 45 megapixels. If true, I think this is just a massive advancement for the Z9. And we'll talk about at the end, what about the Z8? Well, these things come to the Z8 as well. I'm assuming it's the Z9 because that's the flagship. And that's the camera that's most likely to be up against, say, the A9 III, because price-wise, the Z9 is $5,500 US and the A9 III is $6,000. More expensive. Far more expensive than the Z8. Now, this Rumour says creating log C4, or something that's very similar to log C4, which uses the basic color science of the sensor. And also this log C4 is highly efficient, so it's highly efficient for the processor to process. Now this is interesting because we're talking about a couple of different things here. We're talking about color science being awesome, and we're talking about it being super duper efficient. So what does this mean? Efficient as in takes up less space, smaller file sizes, or efficient as in it uses less power, and so you can record for longer. And even more importantly, if you're using less power, if it's more efficient, that means it's creating less heat. I am really interested, if this is real, as to what efficient means in this particular instance. Let's talk here of an 8.3K, 120 frames per second. So that's the full sensor readout burst mode, a video burst mode. Now, again, it doesn't say which video, but might this be 12-bit RAW? That this is a video codec that can now run at 120 frames per second. It's 12-bit, which is pretty awesome in most circumstances, and it might be part of their current 12-bit RAW codec, but it's now running at 120 frames per second, and the Rumour states for 2.5 seconds. Now, all of this is crazy interesting, and again, A9 III people, relax. They would have been working on this for ages, way before the A9 III was announced. Okay, let's unpack what this potentially means. 8.3K, which I think is full sensor readout, so 45 megapixels, either 12-bit or 14-bit, RAW, running at 120 frames per second with full AF and AE for 2.5 seconds, which is almost a whole second longer than the A9 III is doing. And it's only doing it in 24 megapixels versus 45. If that's the case, that's astonishing. And that will be a massive wow moment. And this is why I am more excited for the Z9 than the Z9H, because Z9 owners, of which there are a lot, because people have seen how much of a super duper all-rounder camera that it is, this is epic. This is an epic update to a camera that is already epic. Even if we get some of these things, not all of them. And we'll talk about the Z8, what will happen with the Z8, in my opinion, in a moment. But the last point here on this Rumour is the capacity to handle anamorphic lenses, a whole range of anamorphic lenses, along with being able to have full open gate 3.2 ratio recording on the Z9 sensor. This is all really cool stuff for photographers and for videographers. All right, let's talk about the Z8. Well, look, as I said before, the Z9 is the flagship. It's the one up against the A9 III at the moment, but kind of not. The reality is the Z8 and the Z9 are very similar. There are only a couple of really minor differences between them. And because I think they're running exactly the same architecture, clearly they're running very similar versions of firmware, I would believe that these features would come to the Z8 at some point in time. It's just not a priority. And I get that, because professionals who wanted the power of the Z9, well, they bought it 2 years ago, and they might not own a Z8 at all. They might own 2 or even 3 Z9s. For Nikon to support their professionals, they would be aiming at the Z9 first, unequivocally, and then the Z8 will come later. And I think it would. I think all of these features are relevant, pertinent to the Z8, and, well, if and when it comes, it makes the Z8 an absolutely killer camera, because it's even cheaper than a Z9. There you go, that's the Rumour. So to just wrap that all up, it's a Rumour. If it's true, it's pretty massive. There are a lot of Z9 users out there who will just go, this is literally blowing my mind. And I will be one of them. Even so, most of these things are not specific to my use case. Like open gate is, I like the idea of open gate because it gives me more height for vertical recording. So great, there's something in there for me. My camera keeps advancing. That's really exciting. But for sports, wildlife, action, birding photographers, or anybody who wants to do anything that requires high speed, or if you want to work with anamorphic lenses, there is a lot going on here. And I suppose this would be called Firmware 5 because that's the next major firmware update. So if it happens, wow, Firmware 5, wow. Who knows when it's going to happen? I think Nikon Rumours said sometime before the end of the year, so we may not have to wait too long. I would love to know your thoughts. Anybody, Canon, Sony, Nikon users, Fuji users, what do you think if this level of update comes to the Z9 2 years? 2 years after it's shipped, and it's still keeping it extraordinarily top of the game after 2 years. The best all-rounder in the market, just from my personal perspective, everybody relax, my personal perspective continues to stay the best all-rounder in the market. Love to know your thoughts. Please let me know what you think. Are you a Z9, Z8? What might happen to the ZF? And then, of course, we have all of these other potential EXpeed 7 cameras coming out next year. I think it's going to be another exciting year next year. All right, it's been great to see you. If this is your first time here, I'd love to see you again. So please do subscribe, please share, and please like. Bye for now.